We are happy to be here, and I'd like to actually extend the conversation that Larry just introduced to us about Linux, and if you will allow, open source in the cloud. First, the bad news. I suspect many of us don't need to be continually reminded of the economy that we're in. This is a GDP chart. In fact, Goldman Sachs predicts that IT spending this year will be down 8%. Much worse if you're in the hardware business trying to sell servers, unfortunately. They do predict, however, that in 2010, IT spending will go up by 2%. So we do think there is a light at the end of the tunnel. But for this bad news, I believe, is a catalyst, and is a catalyst for the adoption of interesting and new business models, one of which clearly is open source, not so nearly a new business model anymore. That's not just me talking, that's the press talking, arguing that open source in a time of recession makes sense. And the numbers, frankly, bear this out. So while server shipments are down 21, 22%, depending on which vendor you happen to deal with, software, and in particular open software, continues to grow in this economy because of the compelling business proposition it offers clients. But this is the press view. What's the customer view of this? A couple of interesting data points. Here's a Forrester study that talked about what are your firm's intentions or plans to expand your use of the following software technologies. There was a list of some 20-odd software technologies. Not surprisingly, leading the list for the next 12 months is the use of open source software. And I think Larry and I and others fundamentally believe in that as it's our business. Interestingly enough, as we're here in France today, this country actually leads the way in terms of the intention and the use of open source software in the infrastructure. So this is an interesting picture to look at both geographically, but as we're here in France, I think France is second to none in their use and exploitation of open source software in the environment. We did a study ourselves, being in the Linux business with IDC. By the way, this study is available at novell.com/IDC below. They surveyed over 300 IT decision makers across the world and asked them about their plans for adoptions of Linux and open source in a recession. And overwhelmingly, 72% of customers said that they plan to increase their Linux server adoption in the next 12 months. Not only that, they said that 49% it will be, over the next 5 years, the #1 operating system for new server deployment. The #1 operating system for new server deployment. We've come a long way. We've come a long way because now Linux and open source is ready for mission-critical applications, and now it's clearly the preferred destination platform for Unix migrations, and if we had our way, Windows as well, right? So lots of acceptance on this, not just public relations headlines, but borne out in the research. Now, we live in a heterogeneous world, and while all of us at this conference clearly support and are proponents of open source as the preferred business model for the development and innovation of software, the reality is that most of the customers that we serve live in a mixed IT world. And according to Gartner's own research, 75 to 80% of data centers run both Linux and Windows in their shops. Now, we can choose to ignore those facts, or we can choose to use them to advance the cause and purpose of Linux and open source in the environment. And this research is yet another one, that 67% of customers surveyed rank interoperability and management between their Linux and Windows environment as a key criteria. So our point of view at Novell, and it's shared by many others, is that we're going to embrace interoperability, and we're going to use this fact to continue to promote and advance the cause of Linux and open source in the marketplace. Not ignore the facts that customers are living in this world, but embrace them and use that as a catalyst for Linux source adoption. Now, let me extend a little bit on Larry's comments on Linux in the cloud. He's broad and I think appropriately so, open source in the cloud. Frankly, as he painted the picture, somewhat controversial at front, but then came full circle, it's already there, right? And it's there because it's already established itself, and I'm talking specifically Linux now, as a de facto platform for mission-critical computing. It's already established itself as the foundation for a new data center, whether that's legacy, private cloud, or public cloud. And clearly, Linux and open source has already established itself among many different use cases, desktop to data center. Whether that's servers, whether that's thick client, whether that's thin client, and everything in between. And so clearly, it's grown up, we're ready to go on that perspective. But let me come back a little bit on extending the enterprise in the cloud. Larry jumped right to the cloud, perhaps appropriately so. But even though the cloud gets much of the conversation today, most of our clients continue to live in the internal data center and run the majority of their workloads in the internal data center. And while they have their eye on the right-hand side of this chart, investigating software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service, many of them are running their workloads on internal capacity with the appropriate IT service management and business service management, all secure and compliant. And Linux and open source has clearly established itself as the preferred footprint in this environment. The next thing that our customers are considering, and have already considered, is how do I take advantage of the disaggregation of resources from the physical to the virtual? This was another catalyst born by perhaps and accelerated by the recession. How do I take advantage from an economic perspective of all this compute power that I have, disaggregate that from the workloads that I need to run? This is another area that Linux and open source has clearly established itself as the de facto footprint, particularly on running this internal capacity around virtualization, whether that's XCN or KVM, or whether that's Linux as the perfect operating system or guest for all different types of operating systems, right? VMware, ESX, Microsoft Hyper-V, and many, many others. So clearly, Linux and open source has done a good job there. If I'm being critical and see opportunities for the Linux and open source movement going forward, I believe the layers of IT service management and business service management are ripe for the exploitation of open source technologies. Clients want a single set of tools to manage their workloads, whether it's in their legacy environments or in their private clouds, read virtualization. They also want a consistent set of tools for the business service management piece. And so this is where, while much of the conversation is in the cloud, and perhaps appropriately so, 98, 99% of the workloads that customers run today are in these two environments. And there's plenty of opportunity remaining for open source technologies to move up this stack and to exploit. Clearly, as Larry said, the third option for deploying workloads, and the one getting a lot of attention, is this external capacity, whether that's the Amazon, the Googles, and others. I actually believe that there's a wonderful opportunity for redefinition and participation for open source as the de facto software stack for external capacity or clouds. As Larry said, it's already demonstrating its merits at the operating system layer and middleware layers. But I think as you look at all these layers of the stack, people in this room who are in the open source business, there is plenty of greenfield here. If you think of the telcos themselves who are competing, will have a lot of capacity but are going to be competing against the Googles and Amazons and others, the France Telecoms and others, they're looking for what that software stack is going to look like. And I think open source ought to take the lead in defining that for all the telcos. And so that's how we would think about extending the enterprise to the cloud. It all looks complex, and that's the reason, perhaps because it is. You're talking application workloads and middleware and operating systems and virtual machines and physical servers, all of which is going to get even more complex with the introduction of these trends and new business models. It's interesting. People seek complexity. Most of the customers I talk to, frankly, with all due respect to open source and technologies, don't care about the underlying business models that develop the technology. They care about, can they consume them in a reliable, predictable, and simple way. In fact, if we truly want to advance the open source movement, this is an important chart to take a look at as some of the opportunities, if you will, that we need to address as an industry. This chart says, how important to your organization are each of the following concerns around adopting open source software? Some of the same concerns, by the way, in moving workloads to the clouds. Security of the software, availability of service and support, and the overall complexity and difficulty of adoption, the top three. I'd like to speak as I close about the third one, about how to eliminate the complexity. Those of you in the open source world who haven't taken advantage of appliances, and appliances have been around for a while, particularly hardware appliances. Here I'm talking specifically software appliances, that combination of operating system, middleware, and application designed for a very specific use case and or deployment model. And the promise of appliances is to address the complexity that was the concern in the previous chart, right? Applications can drop up to 80%, or the appliances can drop up to 80% of the cost of acquiring the software. And this isn't my research, this is the facts, Have software developers embrace the appliance, put their application on, specific use case and deploy it immediately. Probably the number one area for the growth of open source going forward. We ourselves announced a tool for this almost 2 months ago, back in late July, SUSE Studio. We think of it as customized Linux, fast and simple, or while you wait. This is the opportunity for independent software vendors to go into, use SUSE Studio, the SUSE Linux operating system as the underlying operating system, pick those components that they need, and package those in an appliance. The uptick on this has exceeded our expectations by orders of magnitude. It's 35,000 users in 2 months, 63,000 builds, and I think most importantly, 3,600 independent software vendors. Even though we're in the operating system business, it's not lost on us that applications drive operating system selection. And so I think for the growth of open source going forward, particularly growth of open source applications, appliances give us one of the most compelling form factors to enhance that growth. So as we close, as we've said here this morning, Linux and open source already distinguishes itself in legacy and in private clouds, already is, in many cases, the de facto standard for the software stack as we extend our data centers to the cloud, both for good technical and business reasons. I would encourage you from here, and many of you, this is preaching to the converted, I'm sure, to embrace Linux in this downturn. It's a wonderful, this opportunity provides a nice catalyst for the exploitation of Linux and open source. To explore appliances, if you already haven't, go to susestudio.com, build your own appliance. I'll guarantee you can do it in less than 15 minutes. And I think we have an accountability as an ecosystem, whether that's open source community members, software developers, systems integrators, or vendors, to continue to expand the open source ecosystem. So with that, I thank you for your attention this morning.